Part 1: The Beginning of the Journey. Linda, Joachim, Marius, and Sylvia gathered on the edge of a small Norwegian village, preparing for their next adventure. There was an air of excitement and anticipation among them. Each of them was eager to delve deep into the ancient forest, which the locals called Trollskogen, the forest of trolls. They had heard many stories about mysterious creatures living there and about strange disappearances that happened to those who ventured too deep into the woods. However, none of the friends believed these tales. Joachim held a map that showed the shortest route to the ancient ruins they wanted to reach. He was always the most responsible among them and took on the role of leader. Sylvia walked beside him, smiling and joking to lift everyone's spirits. Marius and Linda, following behind, discussed their plans for the upcoming night. Linda, being an artist, wanted to capture every moment of their hike on paper. She was already imagining drawing the ancient ruins surrounded by majestic trees. The first day passed quietly. The friends laughed, shared stories, and took photos of the beautiful landscapes around them. The forest seemed friendly, filling them with energy and inspiration. They set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and firs. At night, they listened to the sounds of the forest, the gentle rustling of leaves, the singing of night birds, and the whisper of the wind. Sylvia took out her guitar and played a few songs, which everyone sang along to. But soon, a strange, barely audible noise interrupted the silence. Linda listened carefully and noticed that the sounds of the forest had changed. The birds' singing had ceased, the wind had died down, and an unusual, oppressive silence had settled over them. It seemed as if even the trees themselves were holding their breath, listening to something unseen. Linda looked at the others. Marius had noticed it too, and was peering into the darkness, trying to see where the faint sound was coming from. "Do you hear that?" Linda asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What exactly?" Joachim asked, turning to her. "Maybe it's just the wind or an animal." "No," Sylvia whispered, listening intently. "It doesn't sound like anything familiar." Soon the noise subsided, and the friends decided it was just their imagination. But Linda couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the darkness. The night passed peacefully, but she found it difficult to sleep. The whole forest seemed strangely alive, almost breathing. When she finally dozed off, she had a strange dream. Part 2: The First Dream. Linda dreamt that she was standing in the middle of a forest, surrounded by thick mist. The trees around her looked different, their branches stretched toward the sky like hands trying to grasp something. The mist around her seemed alive, moving, almost breathing. Suddenly she heard a whisper, seemingly coming from everywhere. It was unlike any ordinary wind noise or rustling leaves. It was a clear, quiet whisper in an unknown language. Linda looked around but saw no one. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, and she began to hear her name. "Linda." "Linda," the voice whispered, and it seemed to come from the very heart of the forest. She felt a strange pull, as if someone or something was calling her. Linda began to walk, unaware of where her feet were leading her. The trees around her grew denser, and soon she found herself in a small clearing with an ancient stone altar covered in moss. On the altar lay a large horn decorated with intricate carvings. The horn glowed with a soft green light, and Linda felt her hand reach for it on its own. As soon as she touched the horn, a coldness enveloped her, penetrating to her very bones. Suddenly, a figure appeared from the mist, tall and gaunt, with antlers on its head and a face she couldn't make out in the darkness. The creature approached Linda, and she felt her heart start to beat faster. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The figure raised its hand, and Linda saw that its palm was marked with the same pattern as the one on the altar. "You are chosen," the creature said, its voice echoing through the forest. "You are ours." Linda woke up screaming, drenched in cold sweat. She looked around and realized it was just a dream. But her heart was beating so fast she couldn't calm down. The others had awakened from her scream and were looking at her in concern. "What happened?" Joachim asked, getting up. "Did you have a nightmare?" "Yes," Linda whispered, looking into his eyes. "I dreamt. Something strange. Something frightening." Marius came over and put a hand on her shoulder. "It was just a dream," he said, trying to reassure her. "We're all a bit on edge because of this forest." But Linda knew it was not just a dream. Something inside her told her it was a sign. She remembered the horn she had seen in the dream and the mark on the creature's hand. Her hand started to burn, and lifting her sleeve, she discovered a thin pattern in the shape of a branching horn on her skin, exactly like the one she had seen in her dream. Part 3: The nightmare begins. From the moment Linda discovered the mark on her hand, everything began to go awry. The friends decided to continue their journey, hoping to find a way out of the forest. But the forest seemed unwilling to let them go. The farther they went, the denser the trees became, and the more tangled the paths. The compass they had brought with them spun wildly, pointing in no direction at all. Soon, each of them began to notice strange things. Joachim said he saw a figure in the shadows of the trees, but when he turned to get a better look, it disappeared. Sylvia said she heard a whisper calling her name, but when she turned around, no one was there. Marius began to suffer from headaches and said the forest was pressing on him, that the trees were whispering something in his ear. At night, when they set up camp again, Linda had the same dream. She was once again standing before the altar with the horn, but this time the figure in the mist was closer. She saw its face, and she was filled with horror. It looked like a human face, but with distorted features, as if it had been stretched and twisted. The figure's eyes were empty, lifeless, but at the same time full of malice. This time the creature spoke in an ancient language, and Linda felt her body paralyzed with fear. "You belong to us," the creature whispered, and Linda felt her hand burn even more. The mark on her hand glowed a bright green. She woke up in a cold sweat and realized the mark on her hand had become even brighter. Joachim and Marius noticed this and looked at her with concern. "This can't be just a coincidence," Joachim said, looking at the mark. "I saw the same symbol on ancient stones when we entered the forest. It could be some kind of mark or sign." "We need to get out of here as soon as possible," Marius added, looking around. "I don't know what's going on here, but it's definitely not normal." But no matter how hard they tried to find the way out, the forest was against them. Every time they tried to find a path that they thought would lead them out of the forest, it disappeared, as if it dissolved into the mist. The farther they went, the more the forest became like a maze with no way out. Part 4: Hallucinations and Fears. With each passing day, the friends felt more and more that the forest was affecting their minds. Fatigue and fear began to take a toll on their sanity, and soon each of them started to see things that couldn't be real. Joachim said he saw his deceased grandmother standing among the trees, smiling and beckoning him. He was terrified but felt a strange pull towards her figure. When he tried to get closer, she vanished, leaving only mist in her place. Sylvia saw a huge wolf standing on its hind legs, staring straight at her. Its eyes glowed red and blood dripped from its jaws. She screamed and ran, but when she turned back, there was nothing. The wolf had disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. Marius was suffering from severe headaches and complained of hearing strange voices whispering in his ear. He said he heard them even when he covered his ears. The voices grew louder, and soon he began to scream that he couldn't take it anymore. Linda began to see the figure from her dream in reality. She saw the creature watching her from the shadows of the trees, moving behind them, never falling behind. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, but with each day, it became more real. One night, when they set up camp again, Linda felt the forest around them come to life. She heard the trees begin to whisper, their branches reaching out like hands. Linda woke up and saw that her friends were awake too. They all looked terrified, and fear was written in their eyes. "We need to leave," Sylvia said, her voice trembling. "I can't stay here anymore." But no matter how hard they tried to find an exit, the forest wouldn't let them go. Suddenly they heard a scream. It was Marius. He ran towards the forest, shouting something in an unknown language, and disappeared into the mist. Part 5: The Disappearance of Friends. Marius's disappearance shook everyone. They called for him, searched for him, but could find no trace. The forest around them was filled with sounds, whispers, and creaks, and each sound echoed in their hearts. Linda felt a growing panic inside her. Her friends were disappearing one by one, and she feared she would soon be left alone. They continued on, but the forest seemed to be playing tricks on them. They walked in circles, returning to the same spot. With each step, their strength waned and fear grew stronger. At night, Linda had the same dream again. But this time, everything was different. She stood in a clearing surrounded by trees that reached up to the sky like hands. The fog around her was thick, and she saw a shadowy figure. The creature approached her, and she felt its cold breath on her skin. It leaned close to her ear and whispered, "You belong to us." When she woke up, she realized that the mark on her hand was glowing with a bright green light. She felt a burning sensation, and soon her hand began to numb. Joachim and Sylvia noticed this and looked at her with concern. "This can't go on," Joachim said. "We have to find a way out of this forest." But no matter how hard they tried, the forest was against them. Every step felt like wading through sticky mud, and the fog around them grew denser. Soon Sylvia disappeared as well. She chased a mirage, seeing in the fog her brother, whom she had lost many years ago. She called his name, ran toward him, but the fog swallowed her, and she vanished. Now Linda was left alone with Joachim. They tried to stay together, but fear and despair were so overwhelming that Linda began to lose control. She felt the forest becoming part of her mind, seeping into her thoughts and making her see things that shouldn't be there. Part 6: The Final Confrontation. Joachim tried to support Linda, but he was on the brink himself. They kept moving, not knowing where to go. Suddenly, Joachim stopped. Linda turned around and saw that his eyes were empty. He stood still, like a statue, and his skin began to be covered with tree bark. Joachim, Linda cried, rushing towards him, but he did not move. The bark continued to rise up his body, and soon he had completely turned into a tree. Linda was horrified. She was alone. The forest surrounded her, alive, breathing, watching. She ran, not knowing where to go, but the forest would not release her. She heard whispers, saw a figure in the shadows, felt the mark burning on her hand. Suddenly, the figure with deer antlers and many hands appeared before her again. It approached her, and Linda felt her legs give way. She fell to her knees, and the creature came closer. "You belong to us," it whispered, and Linda felt her consciousness fading. She tried to resist, but the forest was too powerful. It was pulling her in like quicksand, and soon she felt her body becoming part of the forest. She felt her legs turning into roots, her arms into branches, and her body into a trunk. Part 7: The New Community. When Linda finally came to her senses, she realized she was standing among people like herself, with empty eyes and immobile faces. Their bodies were covered in bark, and they stood like living mummies, guarding the forest. She had become one of them, part of this community that worships the forest deity. She didn't want this, but her choice no longer mattered. The forest had embraced her into its eternal embrace, and now she was its forever. Every night, Linda now dreams the same dream. She stands before an altar, surrounded by fog, while the creature with deer antlers looks at her with its empty eyes and whispers, "You belong to us." And every night she wakes up, realizing that this is not just a dream, but her new reality, from which there is no escape. She has become part of the forest, just like everyone else. And the forest will watch over her forever, granting her eternal life but stripping her of freedom.